Hi, my name's Usman. I'm one of the medical students. Do you mind if we have a quick chat about what's brought you into hospital today? Now, those are some of the words I've said relatively consistently now for the last 4 years of my life. And on the face of it, they're very short and simple sentences. But when we take a deeper look at what's going on here, we can begin to understand how we form our identities and how, therefore, we determine our interactions with one another. In the swiftest of verbal exchange, I'm able to establish my role as a caregiver or a medical professional to be, and the patient's identity as someone who is seeking care and support. It is through the acceptance and establishment of these roles we're able to build rapport and trust and discuss some of the most difficult things a human being may ever experience with a complete stranger. Now, my professional identity is one that I've grown accustomed to over time. My personal identity, however, hasn't been so lucky. I remember at the start of my medical school career, we were subject to many a universally acclaimed icebreaker. And in one such icebreaker, we were asked in a lecture hall of some 400 students to write down 5 characteristics that define us as individuals. I managed to cobble together 2 such characteristics, and at the end of the minute, we were asked to discuss with our partners what we had written. You see, my partner had written well more than 5 and struggled to narrow them down. He'd written things that range from the abstract and the emotive, perhaps, to his hobbies and pastimes. And rightly so, he described himself in a very holistic way. On reflection, I described myself in much the opposite. You see, I've been very reductive. I described myself by the colour of my skin and the religious beliefs I held. And this gave me great cause for concern. You see, I wanted to know why I'd chosen to define myself in such a reductive way, and how could someone else be so readily accustomed to describing themselves in a holistic mode? And it's the results of my kind of reading and self-reflection that I want to share with you today. I want us to begin to understand how we form our identities and the issues that may reside therein. To get to that place, however, we're going to take a short detour, and I ask you to bear with me because there is method in the madness. I think it's arguable to say that in society we are witnessing an increased inability to talk to one another, and this pervades through every aspect of our society, but is never really more apparent than in political discourse. When discussing politics and topics of a political nature, we readily fall into a sense of tribalism and us versus them mentality and fail to bridge the gaps in our understanding. Now, with that in mind, let's take another step back and consider initially, at a very basic level, the way our brains operate and work. You see, within the scientific paradigm of evolution, it is clear that the human being has had to develop rapid methods of analysis and efficient cognitive process in order to survive as long as our species has. Daniel Kahneman, in his seminal work, Thinking Fast and Slow, actually popularizes 2 such systems of thinking. System 1 for Kahneman is relatively reflexive, fast and unconscious, and you can see the value in such a mode of cognitive decision making, particularly in a fight and flight scenario. The aptly named System 2, on the other hand, is in stark contrast to its System 1 counterpart. You see, System 2 is deliberate, analytical and conscious. It is slow and allows us to weigh up the pros and cons before coming to a justified decision, an informed decision, so to speak. Now, these systems are often relatively well discussed in literature and are largely understood in society, I'd imagine. What is often overlooked, however, is the way these systems are easily influenced, and due to their efficiency, how we are able to manipulate the way they operate. In sociology or philosophy, we may begin to call these methods of manipulation or biases heuristics, and it's some of those heuristics I want to outline just now. The first heuristic is a concept of anchoring, and this describes the phenomena that we often can determine the outcome of a discussion or negotiation by the initial offering that we start with, and this is usually seen on a daily basis in the art of negotiation and bargaining. You see, we are often taught to start low and stay low, and this determines the price that we end up with. The second heuristic that is worth noting here is the concept of availability. You see, the human mind, if asked to consider how likely an event is to occur, often relies on their ability to draw examples. if something is, if an example is able to be drawn relatively quickly and in abundance, then we perceive this event to be relatively widespread and occur quite often. And I think we can see how this may develop issues in political discourse. And the final heuristic I wish to outline here is the framing heuristic, which suggests our very decision-making is greatly influenced by the way a situation is presented to us. For instance, if I were to tell one individual a new drug had come on the market and could save 70% of lives, they're much more likely to readily accept and approve its use and suitability than if I told another individual that it killed 30% of people. In our modern lives, I think it is arguable that we have overindulged in System 1. We have been influenced in a way that had been almost impossible until the advent of modern technology and the internet. Take the very nature of social media, for instance, where we operate within echo chambers and vacuums where the only opinion we really encounter are those that we already agree with, and these beliefs are further reinforced by complex algorithms that are designed to keep us happy and on social media. And that's an objectively scary thought, particularly when you consider the countless hours we spend on such platforms. All in all, it leads us to a difficult place where we believe what we know is known, as without rational analysis and understanding where and when to appropriately engage System 2, we forget that to know means to place trust in an idea. Knowledge is just faith in a concept. The Persian philosopher Al-Ghazali outlined this relatively well. He wrote one of his initial works, The Aims of the Philosopher, which outlined the views of philosophers at the time. He then countered this with the incoherence of the philosophers, which is a condemning rebuttal of everything he had previously outlined. And I say this to outline the fact that we no longer spend time understanding a topic before we criticize it. You see, everyone is an expert now. A false sense of the obvious and arbitrary morality and faulty methods of analysis are where we find ourselves within society now. And this is a major factor in the divisions we observe around us. We readily fall into demonizing the other and accept a sense of tribalism because there is a failure to agree with each other that is founded upon the fact that we've not even properly disagreed with each other, you see. We don't know why we believe what we believe, or rather, we don't even know what we believe. And if that's the case, how can we even begin to build bridges and cross the divides that we have developed in society? Having spoken previously about this concept, I've often encountered the well thought out rebuttal of "so what?" And the answer to that is quite lengthy, but to keep it short, I think the divisions I've outlined and the methods by which we have engaged to get there amount to an existential threat that affects both the perpetrator of these opinions, but also the victims of such villainization. Those who are villainized and scapegoated are placed in either one or two scenarios. They can either respond in a zealot-like manner and lash out, or they can begin to readily accept the things that have been said about them because these opinions are so overwhelming now, they have no other choice but to begin to internalize them. In fact, we may get to a place where these people choose to explore themselves and identify themselves in a very reductive manner, say perhaps by the color of the skin and the religious beliefs they hold. In acknowledging the divisions in our society and how we may have got there, we can identify the lessons we need to learn and where on an individual level we need to better ourselves. All in all, we need to learn to reject the idea of the Manichaean duality, I'm good, therefore they're bad. And I think this is greatly represented in Homer's Iliad. You see, in this epic depicting the Trojan and Greek war, Achilles commits a great crime by murdering an individual and dragging their corpse around on the ground before letting their corpse be desecrated by wolves. And this was a great sacrilege at the time, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yet, Homer, when adopting the mouthpiece of Apollo, who was on the Trojan side, fails to condemn Achilles here, rather articulating the fact that he is a good man, just like us, but has committed a bad mistake. And it's a failure to condemn someone and the acceptance of this being part of human nature that is relatively important. To illustrate this point further, I'd like you to take a look at the image here. It's a well-known visual illusion, and I want you to take a moment to picture what you see. For some, they see the rabbit, and for others, the duck. And when you're made aware of the other image, you are unable to see and unknow what you have learned and been told. Now you're able to see both perspectives, and this is a suitable analogy from which to build. You see, our views and experiences, and indeed our actions, are often unique to one side of the story and determine the way we view it. And this is a phenomena that, of course, affects societal discourse. To appreciate that our view is one interpretation of an event. And we are not right and they are not wrong. Rather, there is something to be learned in the very nature of the similarities and indeed differences between the perspectives we share. See, this sobering reality breeds self-awareness, humility, and teamwork, and in turn allows us to develop a sense of existential authenticity, creating the respect and care we need to progress as a group. Admittedly, this kind of explanation is somewhat simplistic, but I hope it illustrates the point. I heard that this argument is idealistic and unrealistic, and I understand that point to an extent, and I'd be inclined to agree to an extent too. However, I think we need to acknowledge the unique situation within which we find ourselves. We are in an unprecedented situation here. In the midst of a global pandemic, we have had societal axioms withdrawn and the customs we are accustomed to diminished. Our very mode of thinking has been flipped upside down, and our lives are not the same. COVID-19 has affected every individual of every race, creed, and socioeconomic background, and we have seen our neighbours, families, friends, and more people than we could even imagine suffer in so many different ways. We've been given the opportunity to see that we are all, at the end of the day, just as vulnerable as the other. And it's the recognition of this vulnerability, this collective vulnerability, that gives us strength in knowledge. You see, in the lockdowns that have ensued, we've been isolated in a way that has never been seen before. In the face of mounting existential taxation and stress, we have also been forced, therefore, to develop healthy mechanisms by which to negotiate these. We are forced to go through the problems and become the ideal agent experience, rather than avoid these problems and distract ourselves. So I hope we can see that the pandemic has provided us with an opportunity to recognize the other as our brother or sister, rather than an enemy or a stranger. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided, I guess, an ideal springboard, a catalyst potentially, but we still need to know how we can begin to bridge these divides better. And unsurprisingly, the answer, I think, lies in education. Arnold J. Toynbee, an eminent historian, argued that civilizations don't die, but rather commit suicide through their inability to meet the very faults and challenges they throw up by their actions. And our particular fault, that is the societal divisions we have developed, relies heavily on personal reflection and better education. An education born out of a need to not necessarily cover many topics, but rather discover our sense of humanity. See, this type of education breeds a sense of self-awareness and authenticity that allows for the awareness of the other individual as our brother or sister. The biblical verses on your screen are often quoted as outlining the idea that the greatest commandment is to love thy neighbour as you love thyself. And this is often discussed in both secular and religious circles, but rarely attention is drawn to the verses which also outline the need to love your enemy and seek to understand their pain and actions as human beings too. While many of us may not share the religious context of the biblical tradition, this point still rings true. You see, Ovid once mused that we often see and approve the better but follow worse, while Martin Luther King articulated that the deeds of a man do little but reflect the humanity of that individual. To put it another way, and I should know I was told this analogy at KES, consider the human being as nothing more than a piano. We all have the same keys or characteristics and all capable of playing the same notes and fantastic tunes, but it is up to us and our education to decide which keys to play. In the African continent, there's a beautiful philosophy or theology, depending on how you view it, called Ubuntu, which describes a way of living akin to what I've tried to describe here. Ubuntu literally means I am because of you, or rather, I see you. And you see, it's this seeing and recognition of the other as a reflection of ourselves that is going to breed betterment and help us cross these divides in our society. The late great Maya Angelou once said that hate has caused a lot of problems in the world, but is yet to solve one. I hope we can begin to see the need for reflection in order to allow us to begin to solve the problems aforementioned. And with that being said, hi, my name's Usman, and I haven't quite figured out who I am just yet, but I know I'm human, just like you.